Good morning. I'm in the Gospel of Mark in my Bible, Mark chapter 5. I'd like to encourage you to turn there as we get started with our last Bible class on miracles of Jesus. And I don't use the definite article there, the miracles of Jesus, because we have not looked at all of them by any means. In fact, it seemed like for a while there we were going to stay in the Gospel of John for about a month and a half. We had about 6 sessions on the important miracles in the Gospel of John, but we have digressed to some of the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and now we're going to focus on Mark's telling of the healing of Jairus' daughter. And I've studied this miracle with you in a Bible class setting before. We'll try to remind ourselves of some things that are here and maybe some things we haven't observed before. There are 2 parallels. Matthew and Luke record this miracle as well. If you look on the screen, you can see that Mark has a lot more verses dedicated to this miracle. Which of the 4 Gospels is the shortest? Hoping that's an easy question. Which is the shortest? Mark. That's exactly right. My name is Mark, and I'm kind of short, so maybe that'll help you remember. Well, it doesn't have as many chapters. That is true. Matthew has 28 and Luke has 24. Yes, that's right. Luke is the longest. And together, Luke and Acts, by the way, they make up a quarter of the New Testament. And I bring up Acts because Luke also wrote Acts. Luke wrote 2 books of the New Testament, but he wrote a quarter of the New Testament. Paul, who wrote 13 letters, wrote another quarter of the New Testament. So there's half. Where's the rest? Matthew, Mark, John, and Revelation. They would take up quite a bit in the last few letters. What is curious, though, about Mark is even though he may be the shortest gospel, at times like this, he provides far more detail than the other Gospels. And we're going to see that here. And that's why we're going to focus on Mark's telling of this miracle. Some details that he provides, I'll just tell you right off the bat. You have a little girl, a little daughter, she is called, Jairus' daughter. And how old was this little girl who was at the point of death? 12. And then there is a woman who's never named. She has a hemorrhage that has just wrecked her life. How many years had she had the hemorrhage? 12. Do you think Mark says, hey, this, folks, is a neat coincidence? Or is he going to try to connect these 2 together? Now, it is a coincidence. 12 years old, 12 years of this hemorrhage. Mark mentions that detail, though. Matthew and Luke do not. And I do find that very curious. Why don't we start reading it? And in verse 22 through the end of the chapter. But it's in 3 parts. And we're going to try to observe that this morning. You have Jairus' daughter being dealt with. The woman with the hemorrhage interrupts that, and then you return to Jairus' daughter. And I know you know this already very well. Let's start reading in verse 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. Let's just pause there for a moment. One of the additions that Mark has here is the elaboration about the woman's condition. Matthew and Luke make it very short. She had a hemorrhage. She had this discharge of blood that could not be stopped easily. But what it says here in verse 26 is that she had suffered much under many physicians. And I've always wondered if Luke omitted that, because what was Luke's occupation before he turned historian? A physician. Now, I don't really think Luke said, "Oh, I better not put that in there because that'll disparage my former profession." But it is interesting to me. Mark, why'd you have to put that in there? Don't say all those bad things about us. But she had been suffering under many physicians, and she had spent all that she had, and it hadn't gotten any better, had only gotten worse. Anybody here experienced something like that? Maybe not with a situation like this, as traumatic as a hemorrhage. But have you ever gone to the doctor and spent money and you end up going home and getting worse? It happens. Unfortunately, doctors aren't always able to figure out exactly what's going on and diagnose it and make it all go away. What about the great physician? Can the great physician take care of us without a lot of trying to figure it all out? A couple weeks ago, we looked at the miracle in Mark 8, 22 through 26, and we observed that Jesus had to take a couple of tries, and we talked about why. He was using it as a lesson for his disciples, trying to help them see how short-sighted they were. He healed a blind man in 2 steps. But that never happens except on that occasion. Jesus is able to help both of these people very, very quickly. I wanted to remind you of how Matthew places this miracle. And we discussed this a couple weeks ago when we looked at Matthew chapters 8 and 9. We saw a cluster of miracles. And you can see there under Unit 3, number 1, and you've got Matthew's account, Matthew 9, 18 through 26. And that includes 2 miracles, the raising of Jairus' daughter, that we'll get to this morning, and helping this woman. But that would mess up our 3 units of 3, if we counted that as 2 miracles. We would have 2 units of 3 and then 1 unit of 4. So we can't do that. I think Matthew has purposely arranged these in this way. And these 2 miracles that we're looking at this morning go together. They need to be seen together, even though they are 2 separate miracles. And so I wanted to point that out. I think I went backwards. Okay. Come and heal my daughter. That's what Jairus had asked. Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. So at this moment, the little girl's alive. By the time Jesus gets to her, she won't be anymore, will she? Is there a difference between healing someone and reviving them from death? Just a little. Just a little. Now, how many of you can raise somebody from the dead? Can I see a show of hands? Is that a hand? Oh, you're just scratching your head. Okay. How many of you can heal somebody by touching them? No takers? Well, Jesus can do both. And he would have simply revived this girl who was sick, touching her. But he doesn't, because he's interrupted. And that's what we're looking at right now, the interruption. Yes, sir. You didn't even have to go. Has Jesus ever done that? Just healed somebody from a distance? And we've seen in our study this quarter 2 instances of that. So why did Jesus go? Why didn't he just say, Jairus, your daughter's healed? Okay. I appreciate you saying that. What we have been emphasizing throughout our study on the miracles is Jesus didn't perform his miracles simply for the benefit of some individual. He did it as a teaching lesson. And that's what we've tried to emphasize. And that's what we're also going to consider for ourselves today. Why is it that Jesus didn't just heal from a distance? Well, he's done that before. Why is it that why did he spend time with this interruption? And that's what we need to look at. Look at the verse citation for the woman's interruption. Verses 24 through 34. And I know the verses are kind of arbitrary, but they do indicate to us a lot of time is spent on this interruption, this woman here. So let's read it all the way through verse 34. We're going to pick up in verse 27. We had just read about how this woman got worse from all the doctor's care. Verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you. The crowd was mentioned in verse 24. You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? Are you kidding me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, that's important, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. That's a beautiful, tender scene, but it caused a problem. It delayed them enough so that by the time they get to Jairus' home, his daughter, his little daughter, is dead. Do you think Jesus, being the Son of God, knowing all things, do you think he knew what this interruption was going to happen, what it was going to do? Or do you think when they got to the house, Jesus goes, oh no, that's terrible. I shouldn't have taken so long with that woman.
It's hard to know when people are taking less of scriptures expressing statement, but because of all the other evidence, we know could have done it this way, could have done it that way. There was always intention with why he was doing it. I think the story, this interruption, was intention perhaps. Again, not imputing the motive to the Lord, but he's always intentional because there's several topics.
Okay. Well, let's make sure we bring them out this morning. Yes, ma'am. All souls are important. Okay. Now, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Hold on. All right. Hold on. You say this woman is just as important as Jairus' daughter. We don't even know the name of this woman. And Susan, who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, came up behind you. No, we're not told her name. What did it say about Jairus back in verse 22? He is an important figure. He is a ruler of a synagogue. This is an important man, a powerful man. You're shaking your head. He's not important? Who cares? Well, a lot of people did. Matthew's account tells us that the Jews were saying, hey, you need to pay attention to this guy, Jesus. He needs some help here. People were taking note of this. You got the great crowd following. Everybody's seeing this. Did I hear another? Oh, it's man's view of what's important. What about Jesus? Does he think this woman is important? And he takes the time, even though it delays, and calls her daughter. Isn't that tender? For 12 years, she's been rejected. Let's talk about that for a moment. And again, this is speculation. Yeah, go ahead. That's exactly right. Does that make sense to everybody? She is unclean because of her discharge of blood under the old covenant. She can't go to the synagogue. And we're implying this. It doesn't say specifically. And this woman could not go to the synagogue. If she's constantly unclean, she can't spend time with her family. I mean, otherwise they would be considered unclean. Yes, ma'am. They could stay in their home, I believe, but they had to cleanse themselves over a period of several days. I know. And it's, I mean, just imagine the plight. Because we know what chronic illness is all about.
But if we're following the guidelines, we're all experiencing this isolation.
Yeah.
I don't think
We can kind of imagine, but this is devastating to this woman. It affected her life. Do you all know people, family members, or perhaps for a time yourself, where you were greatly affected by a health condition every moment of every waking day? Chronic back pain, some sort of, you name it, some sort of disorder or disease. And this poor lady is suffering, but she's going to be healed. All right, and how she does it is quite amazing. How does she get healed? She touches the fringe of his garment. I want to point this out. In this section that we're looking at, there's an emphasis on touching. And it's mentioned several times here, verse 27, it says that the woman touched Jesus' garment. And then it tells us what she's thinking about. If I touch even his garment, Jesus asks, who touched my garments? The disciples say, why are you asking who touched me? Touch, 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 touch. What we should remember is no one told this woman, hey, all you need to do to be healed is touch Jesus' garment. Now, do we see that later? Matthew, I know, records how people would touch Jesus' garments or handkerchiefs. People would take handkerchiefs to Jesus, and then they would carry them back, and the person would touch the handkerchief and would be healed. And that happened with Peter as well in the book of Acts. It's quite interesting, but still, this is great faith on this woman's part, isn't it? In fact, what does Jesus say to her in verse 34? He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. And let me go ahead and bring this up. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Jesus says to her in verse 34. What we want to do now is go on to verses 35 through 43, but we're not quite done with this woman. Let me go and bring this up. In the very next verse, it says, Jairus, we need to tell you some bad news. Your daughter is dead. That should be your daughter is dead. You got back-to-back daughter. Of course, Jairus had already said, my little daughter, back in verse 23. You think that's a coincidence? Verse 34 and then verse 35 having the same term of endearment, daughter, for this woman who's full grown, and then this little girl, 12 years old. In the notes, I give an excerpt of a rather famous passage in the Talmud, which would have reflected what Jews, it was written a couple centuries after the first century, but it reflected the mindset of a lot of Jews. And here's a brief little excerpt. If a physician wanted to heal someone of a hemorrhage, what you would do is you would make some potions, and you would set, one of the descriptions, set her in a place where two ways meet, I guess a fork in the road, let her hold a cup of wine in her right hand, and let someone come up behind her and frighten her and say, arise from thy flux. I'm healed. What do you think? And there's more. I mean, I could have put more in that little passage there. It was just crazy. He had all kinds of potions that people were supposed to drink, and then that would suddenly make them well. Yes, sir.
As we're trying to wrap that part up, the contrast or the comparison is greatly seen between this woman and Rahab. Rahab had heard about the miraculous events of the Israelites.
Okay.
She was the only one who said anything. He's sung by a sea of people over here, and she's the only one that received anything.
Okay.
It's amazing. It's amazing to think about how many people do we know that are loving, seeking, saying things about Jesus, but their faith doesn't make them well.
Right. Right.
Impossible.
Okay. So Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Your faith has made you well. What's another way we could translate that? Your faith has made you well. Somebody have a different translation there in verse 34? Your faith has saved you. Now, that can't be what Jesus means. He means what the ESV is rendering this as. Your faith has made you well. But literally, it is your faith has saved you. How did her faith save her? From her physical ailment? Both. I think that's right, doctor. I think that there's a lot to that. Your faith has made you well. Jairus, how do you think he would have responded to Jesus? I mean, speculation on our part. How do you think he would have responded to Jesus saying, "Oh, Jairus, I can heal your daughter from right here. I don't need to go to your home"? Take a guess, because we've seen it in other places where Jesus said that, and the guy said, no, you got to come to my house. And it was a Gentile, by the way, who actually volunteered to let Jesus heal from a distance. And he was amazed by that man's great faith. I would imagine Jairus would have balked at that. Faith and belief, they're the same concept, and we're going to see that really emphasized here. So our brother visiting with us has talked about this woman's faith when no one else seemed to have the great faith that she had in this crowd. All she had to do, she thought, was touch Jesus' garment. So we've already looked at these verses that are on the screen, and I made them smaller so that I could fit verse 41, where Jesus is going to touch this little girl. And we're going to read that right now. He's going to touch this little girl by taking her by the hand. And I think that's interesting as well. This emphasis on touching. Verse 34, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease. All right, let's move on. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing, the ESV says, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. I think that's important. This woman, I said we were done with her, but we're not. This woman had faith. She believed that all she had to do was this crazy act of touching Jesus' garment, and it worked. Jairus, his daughter, has just died. When he finally gets that news, what do you think happened to him physically? What happened to Jairus? Yeah, the color went out of his face. He's upset. And that would motivate Jesus to say, no. It's okay. Do not fear, only believe. Yes, ma'am. Right. Okay. So Jesus goes on to his home, and Jairus is saying, all right, you take care of this. You're going to help my daughter. Well, we don't read that. But But do you think after Jesus does revive his daughter, Jairus is going to have an increase in his faith? Why did he go to Jesus at all? He believed in Jesus? Okay. I have another theory. Again, we're not told, so you're probably right to say that he had faith in Jesus. I think Jairus is desperate. He has no choice. He has nowhere else to turn. His daughter is sick. This supposed miracle worker. I mean, again, we don't know, and I'm not trying to speculate too much, but I'm trying to help us see that this is no guarantee. We know what happens, but this man didn't know. Laverne? Okay. And again, we can't be definitive on that. Yes, sir?
Again, as we get to see everything.
Yeah, we know after the fact.
So we get to know other passages, but as he's building up to these other places, think about us for today, because life in this world is desperate, absolutely desperate. There is no place to turn, and death occurs around us all the time. But don't be afraid. Just believe, right?
Right.
And we look at the passage in Thessalonians chapter 4. Don't sorrow as others don't sorrow as one now.
Right.
Because I think one of the miracles, we raised the dead.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got to have faith. In fact, why don't we finish reading so we can get through this? I'm sorry, folks. I'm taking too long to just read it. You see in verse 36 where Jesus says to the ruler of the synagogue, I know what they just said here, but do not fear, only believe. Verse 37, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And why are they weeping and wailing? Little girl's dead. My understanding is these probably were, some of them at least, professional wailers and weepers. But there's a commotion. People are upset. People are there to support them. The child is not dead, but sleeping, Jesus says. Is the girl just sleeping? Okay. And what was the response of all those weepers and wailers? They went from weeping and wailing to laughing. They laughed at him. Can you imagine people laughing at Jesus? Laughing at our Lord and Savior. Well, he put them outside. So he couldn't have all 12 disciples. He had 3, Peter, James, and John. Do we ever see Jesus with just Peter, James, and John in other places? The Transfiguration comes to mind. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he had those 3 follow with him closely. Of course, they just slept. So that is interesting. They laughed at him. He put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. So how many people are in this room? You got the girl, you got Jesus, mom and dad, and 3 disciples. Just a handful of people. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, Aramaic for, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. All right, if we were just studying Mark's gospel, which I guess we're kind of doing this morning, we're just looking at Mark's account, I would emphasize how in Mark's gospel, there's a premium placed on concepts like fear and amazement. Trembling is another expression of that fear. You remember how the woman who was healed of the hemorrhage, she was shaking. She was fearful and trembling when Jesus put the spotlight on her and said, "Hey, who touched me?" And then he says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." Let's look at a contrast here between the situation with Jairus and this woman. I guess Jairus is now ceremonially unclean because he's with his daughter who's dead. And this woman, as we said, the old law talks about how someone with a discharge of blood is unclean. What I also think is an important contrast to see is that Jairus' name is given to us. He's important. This woman is a nobody. I mean, who cares about this woman? And we've already discussed that a little bit. Jesus cares. Every person is important. And I think that's an interesting contrast. The 12 years, what is the significance of that? Well, if nothing else, it connects these two incidents together. These two little stories, they go hand in hand, and that is solidified by the mention of daughter. Both of them are called daughter. Jairus says, "My little daughter." The crowd says, "His daughter, your daughter is dead." Well, Jesus called this woman daughter. And then you have this. The woman, this unnamed nobody, she didn't need Jesus to tell her, "Just have faith." She already had it. Jairus, this important ruler of a synagogue, needed faith. In the Gospel of Mark, there are several intercalations, they're called. Sometimes you hear the expression, a Markan sandwich. I like that. I'd like a sandwich. Where you have the beginning of an incident, an interruption, and then the resumption of that first incident. And you see it a lot in the Gospel of Mark. The question is, how are these two situations, how are they related to each other? It'd be one thing if Jesus had just been walking along. And Jesus one day was walking along and a woman touched the fringe of his garment and she was healed. Great, yay! But it's paired with this situation with Jairus. When they're juxtaposed together like that, they create a contrast. What is the contrast? And I think we've already touched on this this morning. She has faith. There's nobody. Jairus needs a shot in the arm. He needs the encouragement. Does Jairus get the encouragement he's looking for? He needs. How? His daughter was not simply healed. She was raised. And how do they respond? Verse 42 says they are overcome with amazement. That's another key concept in the Gospel of Mark. How people were amazed by Jesus. Not just his miraculous activity, by the way. They were also amazed at the gracious words coming from his mouth, from his preaching and teaching. It was powerful and it was effective. Could I show you something here? Leave Mark 5 and go over to Mark 16 for just a moment. We could look at numerous examples of the concept of fear in the face of doubt, difficult situations. And you have the combining of this idea of fear and amazement juxtaposed in Mark 15, verse 8. And I know there's verses 9 through 20, but I just want to look at verse 8. You have Jesus raised from the dead. The tomb is empty. These women have come to the tomb. Jesus is not there. Who is there, though? Who's at the tomb? Two young men. Or one young man in this account. One young man sitting there. One was on the stone. One was on the stone. Looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. Okay, so you got a young man sitting on the right side. We know from the other accounts that this is not just some mere mortal, is it? This is an angel. And they said, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And then verse 8 of Mark 16 says, and they went out and fled from the tomb and went and told everybody about Jesus, how he had been raised from the dead. The end. That's not what the verse says. Now, do the women go and tell the disciples? How do we know they do? Because the rest is history. We know about Jesus' resurrection. We know from Matthew, Luke, and John's accounts that the women did go and tell the disciples eventually. But that's not what Mark emphasizes in verse 8. What is the initial reaction of the women? They went out, fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to no one. Why? Because they were afraid. I love that. And I'll tell you why. Because that's me. I get afraid. And I need the strength of the Lord to help me overcome my fear. And I suspect there might be somebody else who feels that way. Raul, is that a hand up?
Yes, sir. Just one time I was with my school friend. He graduated from school and went swimming. I said, this really is swimming with the legs. We were swimming out in fun. All of a sudden, there's a hand go out with my hand. I pulled and I was able to get out the legs. Here it was in front of the end. And so he went and I saved him. But you know what? After that incident, I don't go swim unless I'm there. And that happened by accident. I didn't see him. Literally, I said that. You would think that after this guy saw the miracle of the woman, that he probably would have come to him and said, oh, God, how I believe in Jesus.
Right.
I said, no, that's all good. But we are in incidents, and see the Bible, they call God Jesus Christ. And yes, they call that Jesus Christ. But the enemy will find us
Okay. So what is the takeaway from these two miracles? What is it that it's supposed to do? Simply help Jairus' family? Oh, our daughter's alive now. That's great. Simply help this woman? Or what is it that it's supposed to do to help us all? Faith. Our faith needs to grow. We need to overcome our fear. Yes, sir.
There's a couple things, and we already touched on all of them, is the mocking. When Paul is preaching on Mars Hill, it gets all the way to the point of
The resurrection,
Then
right.
They begin mocking.
Yeah.
But there was a few that didn't, which brings us to the few. They had the faith, despite the fact that only a few are going to have the quality of faith that subscribe to the scriptures. We have a religious culture, but they don't have the faith.
We have a religious country, if you say so.
Well,
If you say so.
religion of a different sort, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
But despite what everybody's doing, we have to have the faith that's in Christ and the scriptures.
Okay.
That's what we
We need to have the faith in Christ, and we derive that from the scriptures. I'm repeating it so that folks at home can hear as well. Go ahead. Okay, these two put together. Right.
So it shows to me the power of Jesus over the body.
Right. In Matthew 8 and 9, when you have all that, those cluster of miracles, it shows Jesus' great power over demon possession, over the elements, where he stills the sea, walks on water. I don't think he walked on water in Matthew 8 and 9, but it's just amazing the breadth of Jesus' power over everything. After all, he is the creator, he is the sustainer, of everything. Do you ever feel like you need a dose of faith, that you feel discouraged? Has anything happened to you in 2020 that kind of knocks you off your game? Anything? Okay. We're being tested?
Which list?
Which list? Which list? All right. Here's a simple verse at the end of Ephesians chapter 3. We need to remember that he, let me turn the passage so I can, and I know you know this passage. It needs to be in our heads. It needs to be in our hearts. And so let me remind you. This is part of his prayer for them to be strong, grounded in love, the strength to comprehend what is the breadth and length and height and depth, to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, God's power at work within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Paul occasionally just can't help himself in his letters. He just breaks out in a doxology of praise. And here at the end of Ephesians 3 is one of those. We need to remember the God whom we serve is at work in us and is helping us. Jesus chided his disciples in Matthew 17. He says, you can't take care of this problem, this demon possession, because of your little faith. Is he talking to Gentiles here? Is he talking to reprobates? No, he's talking to his disciples, his apostles. And he says, I tell you, if you just had the faith like a grain of mustard seed, nothing would be impossible for you. How large is a mustard seed? What is Jesus' point? If you just had a teensy-weensy little amount of faith, mustard seed, teeny, teeny, tiny, then you could do anything. You could move mountains. A teensy-weensy little amount of faith. If you just have that, you can do so much. So what is the implication? Their faith isn't just small, it is infinitesimal. It is teeny, teeny, tiny. When we're faced with this pandemic and all the craziness that's going on in our country, in our world, we watch the news, we read the news stories, we talk about it. Do we ever say, thanks be to God, he's going to take care of it all? Or do we simply wring our hands and focus so much on the craziness that's in our world?
Another way you could say faith, of course we see belief and faith.
Faith and belief, right? Go together.
There's obedience that are intertwined. I think one of the words that sums all these things up is conviction. When you have conviction, faith, right, then you automatically have confidence because decisions and choices are already made in your mind.
Another word I would throw out is trust. The concept in the Old Testament a lot of times is wait for the Lord, wait on the Lord. And that's talking about us trusting him. Say, all right, I'm leaving it in your hands. We're almost out of time. I appreciate the participation we've had this morning. Participate with me one more time. Philippians 4, verse 13. Paul says, I can do all things through him, through Christ, who strengthens me. What Paul is saying in this context is, if I want to run through a brick wall, God will help me do it. Boom. Okay, metaphorically. What is the context here? Where Paul's talking about, I know how to be in need and to suffer loss and everything. He's saying, in whatever situation I'm in, God is going to take care of me. I'm going to get through it. Do you agree with that? What do a lot of people, when they quote this verse, what do a lot of people think Philippians 4, verse 13 means? Physically, they can do anything. They can just do anything they want, no matter how crazy it is.
I can make up worship.
Okay.
I can make up work on I can make up work in the church. I can make up any situation and get through it. Pastor Secretary.
Is that what this verse is saying? But what is it saying?
I can live in this world
Okay. In whatever situation we find ourselves, we have help. He who is working, the power working within us, God can abundantly, far more abundantly than we can ask or think. And this is just a sampling of a few passages. Thank you. I have enjoyed this quarter of study. Next week, I won't be teaching in this class anymore. I know. Shane Torno is going to be talking about the influence of a woman. Several women in the Bible. The first two he's going to talk about are Eve and Mrs. Job. I'm looking forward to that study. I'm going to be in here with you. I'll tell you a funny story. Y'all can dismiss if you want. But I went up to Tiffany Mock and I said, I'm not teaching next Sunday morning. How about if I teach the 2-year-old class? And you know what she did? Josh, you know what your wife did? She laughed at me. And a couple days later, I reneged. Am I nuts? All right. Thank you.